Imagine a presidency defined by just one single unwavering conviction, one that, well, it propelled the leader to incredible popularity at first, but ultimately reshaped a nation's standing and its values in ways maybe no one really predicted. Today, we're diving deep into the George W. Bush era. We want to reveal how this good versus evil mentality became sort of the crucible for a really profound American transformation. Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take stacks of information and try to turn them into clear, compelling insights for you. Our mission for you today, the curious learner, is to really unpack how this particular worldview, this mindset, came to define an era, how it led to policies that profoundly reshaped America's place in the world, and its core values. We'll explore that surprising initial unity, the dramatic shift later in public opinion, and the lasting impact.
And for this, we'll be drawing heavily from a really insightful analysis in Glenn Greenwald's book, A Tragic Legacy: How a Good vs. Evil Mentality Destroyed. It meticulously documents the powerful forces at play during Bush's time in office. It gives a critical lens on this whole period.
Okay, so let's unpack this. After the horrific events of 9/11, what did the sources tell us about President Bush's public standing? Where was he at?
Well, the analysis shows something almost unprecedented, a huge surge in popularity. His approval ratings, they consistently stayed above 60%, often around 66%. That reflects really broad national support, Republicans, Democrats, independents. It's genuinely hard to overstate how widely supported he was in that initial period, even up to and following the March 2003 invasion of Iraq.
And it wasn't just like abstract approval numbers, was it? This support actually translated into political power. How did that play out in the 2002 midterms?
Precisely, yeah. It wasn't just abstract. His personal popularity, combined with his firm stance on Iraq, it led directly to a historic Republican victory in the 2002 midterms. They took control of the Senate, significantly increased their hold on the House. That's extremely rare for a sitting president's party in a midterm.
Wow, okay.
And it wasn't a coincidence. His conduct right after 9/11 really generated a lot of confidence across the political spectrum, actually.
What specifically about that early conduct built that confidence? What was he doing?
Well, his handling of the Afghanistan invasion helped. At the time, it looked like a pretty rapid success, overthrowing the Taliban.
Yeah.
And also his speeches. They were maybe a bit shaky at first, but they quickly became quite resolute, inspiring even. He conveyed this focused anger, but importantly seemed to avoid outright vengeful rhetoric. He promised to pursue those responsible, sure, but seemed to steer clear of, like, a rash overreaction.
I remember him making efforts to emphasize unity and tolerance, too. Did the sources highlight specific examples of that?
Oh, absolutely. He specifically said the enemy was a band of fanatics, not Muslims generally, or Middle Eastern countries. In his big speech to Congress, September 20th, 2001, he urged tolerance for Muslims, goodwill towards other nations. He even thanked Democratic leaders by name Hastert, Gephardt, Daschle, Lott for their friendship. And he made that very public appearance at the Islamic Center in Washington, denouncing intimidation against Muslim Americans. That kind of intentional outreach, it definitely resonated.
So as this period of national unity sort of solidified, a particular worldview started taking center stage in the administration. What was this underlying philosophy the sources identify as really central to his presidency?
The core mentality, the book argues, was what's called Manicheanism.
Manicheanism.
Yeah, it's an absolutist perspective. It tends to understand all issues in really simplistic good versus evil terms. And for Bush, he seemed to see himself as a crusader for good. So anything that got in his way was, well, by definition, an ally of evil.
Okay.
That's why he called himself the decider, right? And famously said, either you're with us or you're against us.
Could you maybe elaborate a bit on what Manicheanism actually means beyond just, good versus evil?
Sure. Historically, it actually comes from a 3rd century religion. The idea is the world is cleanly divided into these opposing forces, pure good and pure evil. For someone who believes this, the battle between good and evil is everything. It overrides all other considerations. So any measure you take to promote good or undermine evil, it's seen as inherently necessary. It's just regardless of practical problems or evidence it's failing or even growing opposition.
And the sources suggest that Bush's personal Manichean worldview, it was deeply rooted in his religious faith. Is that right?
Yes, that's a key part of the analysis. He identified Jesus as his favorite philosopher, talked about praying for strength to do the Lord's will. This evangelical fervor, as the book describes it, often seemed to outweigh other impulses, even traditional political conservatism.
That's fascinating because that worldview, rooted in personal faith, it seems like it directly contradicted some basic principles of the conservative movement that actually elected him. How did that divergence play out in his governance?
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. That This approach often stood in pretty stark contrast to, let's call it, pure abstract political conservatism. Ideas like a restrained federal government, minimal taxes, limited spending.
Right, the usual tenets.
Exactly. But the Bush administration oversaw massive increases in domestic spending. It turned a multi-billion-dollar surplus into an even larger deficit, created vast new bureaucracies.
And that leads us right to the expansion of federal power, too, even into areas usually handled by states. What are some concrete examples there?
Well, we saw an unprecedented expansion of federal power.
Wow. So this deeply personal belief system, it wasn't just a private conviction. It really became the lens for shaping policy, even when it clashed head-on with the principles of the movement that put him in office. That's quite an insight into how leadership can transform ideology. Okay, so the next big turning point then, and ultimately the catalyst for the collapse of his public standing, it really centers on Iraq. The book details how President Bush really devoted himself to convincing Americans that Saddam Hussein was this grave threat, right?
Yeah, despite the fact that Iraq hadn't attacked the U.S., wasn't threatening to, and didn't really have the capability to attack the U.S.
And then came the WMD revelation.
Right, the definitive finding that Saddam had no WMDs. And this came from Bush's own hand-picked weapons experts. That was truly devastating. It was a symbolically huge event. It just dramatically altered public opinion. It led to this profound sense of deep betrayal and irreversible mistrust, as the book puts it. The analysis shows this really catalyzed what you could only call the near-total collapse of the Bush presidency's public support. The war quickly became not just embarrassing, but dangerous, destructive, as Iraq descended into chaos.
And how did the media play into this whole narrative? The source mentioned the axis of evil and comparisons to Hitler.
Yeah, the American media often depicted the invasion as necessary to defend America from evil. It often failed to really disabuse the public of the myth that Saddam had planned 9/11.
Which he hadn't.
Which he hadn't. The administration skillfully created this powerful framework where if you opposed the president, you were basically siding with evil. Remember the axis of evil speech, grouping Iran, Iraq, North Korea together. And you had administration officials like Richard Pearl and prominent evangelical leaders like James Dobson openly comparing Saddam Hussein to Adolf Hitler.
If we connect this to the bigger picture then, the administration's ability to control the narrative, often using this really emotionally charged good versus evil framing, it created an environment where just questioning the war became almost, well, unpatriotic.
Exactly.
It raises a really important question, doesn't it? What happens to a democracy when facts seem to become secondary to these sort of faith-based convictions?
It's a critical question.
That Manichean framework also seemed to do a lot to demonize critics, stifle any rational debate.
Yeah.
Can you give us some examples of how dissent was handled, especially when people offered warnings that, in hindsight, turned out to be pretty accurate?
Absolutely. Individuals who gave these prescient warnings, like Howard Dean, they were just scorned, demonized. Dean accurately predicted the chaos, the protracted occupation, increased terrorism, the lack of WMDs.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yet he was mocked, caricatured as this wild-eyed fringe radical. Jim Webb, a decorated Marine combat hero, Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector, they also voiced strong opposition and were largely ignored or attacked. Even John Perry, when he advocated for more of a law enforcement operation against terrorism, that was widely mocked, too. And you had instances like Lynn Cheney publicly challenging Wolf Blitzer on CNN, asking him, do you want us to win? That really shows how dissent was stifled, how the media was pressured to pick a side.
This demand for absolute loyalty, which the book links to Bush's faith-based approach, it led to inevitably pushing out officials who disagreed. This kill the messenger attitude, as the book calls it.
Yeah, creating perceptions of reality that are pleasing but fictitious.
And the analysis notes Bush himself relied heavily on his aides for information, even boasted about not reading newspapers. It sounds like it fostered a White House where conspicuous intelligence seemed actively unwelcome.
And that contributed to this unwavering certainty, even when things were clearly going wrong. For example, the president expressed optimism about the 2006 midterms, despite overwhelming polls predicting Republican losses. He consistently insisted on progress in Iraq, even as the chaos and violence escalated. The Iraq Study Group's findings directly contradicted this, documenting significant underreporting of the violence in Iraq by the administration itself.
Given this drive for absolute power, maybe it's not surprising what the administration was willing to do to get around existing laws. What specific un-American practices, as the book terms them, were highlighted?
Yeah, this is critical. The administration deliberately violated existing laws, like FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which governs spying inside the U.S. And the argument in the book is this wasn't just out of necessity, but to establish the principle that the president wasn't bound by law. The source details several profoundly un-American practices.
One of the most potent examples seems to be the indefinite detentions, including American citizens, right? What happened to Jose Padilla?
Right. Padilla, a U.S. citizen, was held for 3.5 years. No charges, denied access to lawyers, subjected to just horrific conditions, solitary confinement, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, physical abuse. Ali Salah Khala Amari, a Qatari citizen legally in the U.S., got similar treatment. Pulled from the judicial system, held indefinitely in military prison.
And these weren't just isolated cases.
No, the analysis stresses these weren't rogue acts. The Military Commissions Act of 2006 actually formally authorized these kinds of actions, even for legal residents of the U.S.
Beyond the detentions, the use of coercive interrogation techniques, which is really just a euphemism for torture, was also approved. What did the sources reveal about those practices?
The analysis shows they were widespread. Included things like rendering detainees, shipping them off to other countries known for torture, even detainees who were later found to be innocent. The interrogation of Mohammed al-Qahtani at Guantanamo Bay is detailed as an example: shocking humiliation, physical abuse, desecration of his religious texts. And the sources emphasize these actions were expressly approved at the highest levels of the administration.
Okay, here's where it gets really impactful, I think. This wasn't just about one person's misjudgment. It was more like a systemic shift, where pursuing this perceived good directly led to actions that America itself had previously defined as evil.
Exactly.
It really raises the question, what happens when moral certainty just overrides moral constraints? The traditional American ethos, it prioritizes liberty even if it means accepting some risk to limit government power, like the Fourth Amendment. Yet under Bush, we saw what looks like a clear betrayal of those values.
Indeed. We condemn these practices when other countries do them. Senator Mel Martinez, for example, celebrated the release of a U.S. citizen convicted of terrorism in Vietnam, Kuk Foshi, who actually got legal rights there. Yet Martinez supported the Military Commissions Act, which denied similar rights to detainees held by the U.S. It's a stark contradiction.
Yeah. And you saw the impact elsewhere, too. U.S. press freedom rankings plummeted.
Yeah.
Reporters Without Borders ranked the U.S. from 17th down to 53rd globally by 2006, lower than Mozambique and Botswana at the time.
So moving on from Iraq, attention then shifted to Iran. It quickly became the administration's next perceived grave threat, the next state sponsor of terrorism in their narrative.
Right. Iran's leaders were depicted as the new Hitler, the current incarnation of pure evil. And this came with escalating rhetoric, aggressive military moves, deploying a second aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf, detaining Iranian military officials inside Iraq.
And this approach was heavily pushed by influential neoconservatives. Yes, figures like Bill Kristol, Charles Krauthammer, John Podhoretz, they were openly calling for war with Iran, often using those simplistic Hitler appeasement analogies, dismissing any other approach as just weak or delusional. Kristol even publicly urged President Bush to leave a G8 summit, fly to Jerusalem, and declare, "This is our war too."
What's really remarkable, though, is how many opportunities for cooperation seem to be ignored. Did the sources suggest Iran actually was acting like a rational state sometimes?
The analysis definitely indicates Iran often acted as a rational state actor. For instance, they helped the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan after 9/11. They were quietly helpful in the U.S. effort to oust Saddam Hussein. There was even, according to the source, an extraordinary 2003 overture from Iran offering full-scale rapprochement with the U.S. and was categorically refused by the Bush administration.
Wow.
It's a stark contrast to how a show-of-force strategy reportedly worked with Libya's Gaddafi, getting him to make concessions. It really shows how a fixed moralistic lens can maybe blind you to actual opportunities.
And the sources also point to the significant, though often unspoken, role of Israeli interests and right-wing American pro-Israel supporters in shaping that hostile stance towards Iran.
Yes, the book highlights what it calls a manipulative and dishonest attempt to conflate Iran's posture toward Israel with its posture toward the U.S. as a way to justify American aggression.
This whole good versus evil foreign policy, It must have had a profound impact on America's global standing. How did the rest of the world see the U.S. during the Bush presidency?
Well, there was a drastic decline. A BBC survey cited in the book actually placed the U.S. between Iran and North Korea in terms of negative image globally. 51% viewed the U.S. negatively, only 30% positively.
Ouch.
The book argues U.S. actions alienated allies and, maybe paradoxically, strengthened anti-American factions. It points to the democratic election of leaders hostile to the U.S. Hamas, Hezbollah, Hugo Chavez, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as partly resulting from this alienation.
And despite all the soaring rhetoric, this unprecedented war of civilizations, the president never actually asked Americans to sacrifice anything for it.
Exactly. No draft. He even opposed costly security measures like thorough port inspections. It's a really stark contrast to leaders like FDR, who rallied the nation for shared sacrifice during World War II.
It's interesting, too, how Bush increasingly invoked Harry Truman's legacy. Comparing himself to Truman, unpopular at the time, but supposedly vindicated later by history.
Yes, and the sources suggest this Truman complex actually led him to rigidly dig in, become less open to change when challenged. It further entrenched him in his chosen course, even when it seemed to be failing.
Which raises that important question again.
Right. How can a foreign policy really be effective when it seems divorced from objective facts, from pragmatic considerations, when it's driven instead by this fixed moralistic lens, especially when it ends up alienating partners and, ironically, strengthening the very forces it claims to be fighting?
So as we pull back from this deep dive, it just becomes undeniably clear, doesn't it? The presidency of George W. Bush was profoundly shaped by this powerful, unwavering conviction in a good versus evil world.
Yes, and this Manichean outlook, while maybe it provided a clear guiding principle for him as a leader, the argument is it ultimately led to policies that tragically undermined the very American values and global standing they were supposed to defend. The consequences, as these sources show, were incredibly far-reaching. From, the erosion of democratic principles here at home to actually strengthening adversaries abroad.
And the transformation of the U.S. political landscape itself, shifting away from traditional liberal-conservative debates towards this new divide over the neoconservative Manichean approach that remains such a critical part of his legacy.
Absolutely.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, moving forward?
Well, our deep dive has shown how a singular, unyielding worldview, especially when it's tied to immense power, can lead to these deeply contradictory, even destructive outcomes. The president, convinced of his own righteousness, ended up engaging in practices previously condemned by the U.S., weakening our credibility, and maybe paradoxically dismantling some of the very principles he aimed to uphold.
It's a complex picture.
Definitely. So here's a final provocative thought for you to ponder. Given how this deep dive reveals the profound impact of a leader's deeply held, inflexible convictions on a nation's destiny and its global standing, what fundamental questions should you consistently ask about the core beliefs driving any political leader, especially when they frame complex challenges in these stark, uncompromising terms of absolute good versus absolute evil?